Hello and welcome to another edition of On Our Terms, a video series by AIA Contract Documents. In this video, we're going to be talking about concealed or unknown conditions. My name is Mike Cover, and I'm joined by my colleague Jimmy Germano. We're both attorneys based in the Washington, D.C. area who work with the AIA's Contract Documents Committee. As always, we can't give legal advice in this video. Please take a look at one of our last few slides for our full legal disclaimer. And Jimmy, before I pass it off to you, I just want to mention we probably could have spent an entire hour talking about concealed or unknown conditions. Every contractor I've ever talked to has a crazy story about finding something buried under the ground or hidden deep within the walls of some existing building. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say, and maybe one of these days we'll do a real long story or a long video where we actually talk in depth about some kind of anecdotal stories.
Sure, and actually, as a quick 20-second anecdote on that point, I was once giving a presentation on the differing site conditions clause in a high-rise building, and there was a construction project across the street, and during my presentation on differing site conditions, we had to evacuate the building because the contractor across the street apparently came close to a gas line, which may have been buried and was a concealed or unknown condition. So I thought that was very appropriate for that presentation.
There you go.
But as Mike said, we're gonna jump right into differing site conditions. So if you've seen these On Our Terms videos in the past, you know we kind of jump right into the text of the A201 or whatever contract clause we're talking about and really analyze like a couple words or a couple phrases that are a little bit nuanced. For differing site conditions, actually, in my opinion, the most interesting part about DSCs, differing site conditions, it's the history and the rationale behind it. So there's a famous construction law treatise out there that I'm going to quote from for a second, and it summarizes the history and the rationale of DSC clauses way better than I ever could. It's Bruner and O'Connor, and it really encapsulates and embodies this clause and the reason why we need it very perfectly. So. To the construction industry in the early 20th century, one thing was clear. Any contractor that planned to survive in the construction business needed to include in any fixed price bids involving earthwork a price contingency to cover the gamble associated with unanticipated site conditions. Such a gamble, one, is difficult to judge under normal circumstances due to variability of soils, and two, is compounded by the lack of uniformity among judicial opinions applying the doctrine of sanctity of contract and its myriad exceptions, which collectively gave contractors little practical guidance in appraising the economic and legal consequences of site condition risk. As a result, contractors were placed on the horns of a difficult dilemma, whether to include in their bids sufficient pricing contingencies large enough to protect against the site conditions gamble, or to eliminate or reduce such contingencies in order to better assure submission of the lowest bid. So that gives you a little background into why, an introduction, I guess, into why DSC clauses exist. So before the 1920s or so, there was inconsistent bidding. A contractor didn't know whether or not it should include this question mark contingency, the gamble, so to speak, as Bruner and O'Connor calls it, in their bid. And as a result, owners were receiving bids all over the place. And you can sort of guess which bids included this gamble, the contingency, or not. The ones that were higher did, and the ones that were lower did not. Well, the ones that were lower, they may have gotten the work, but if they found something or they encountered a concealed or an unknown condition, they probably went out of business or definitely got involved in litigation. So throughout the 1920s and 1930s, you started to see these DSC clauses begin to appear. And oddly enough, and it's not the way we think about things nowadays, but in the 1920s and 30s, the federal government actually led the way in an effort to resolve this problem sort of throughout the mid and late 20s by adding what is now referred to as a change conditions clause into federal construction contracts. The first time the AIA contracts included it was in the 1937 edition of the General Conditions, so sort of, again, mirroring what the industry was doing, how the industry was reacting to this problem and including it. So just a little historical background, some interesting nuance as to why this clause exists. you can think about it, it benefits owners and contractors, and I think contractors might think it benefits owners and owners might think it benefits contractors, but both parties are benefited. Owners receive more uniform bids as a result of the DSC clause, and contractors receive a little bit of protection if they do encounter differing site condition throughout the course of the work. So let's jump in. This is the DSC clause from the A201, and it's quite lengthy, 3.7.4, and there's actually a second paragraph below it. It talks about essentially discovering human remains or very interesting and very rare things on a construction project. We're not going to get into that. We're going to focus on this 3.7.4. We're going to focus mostly here for the next 3 or 4 minutes on the fact that there's two kinds of differing site conditions. There's what's known as a type 1 and a type 2. So let's break them down and talk about what each one is and how they work. So the first type of differing site condition is known as a type 1 DSC, and it occurs when the contractor encounters something different than what was indicated in the contract documents. So an example of a type 1 DSC would be a subsurface condition that's encountered that's different than what's represented in a soil borings report or a geotech report, if those reports are considered contract documents. So the point of a type 1 differing site condition is the contractor can point to something in the contract documents that's different than what it encountered in performing the work. A type 2 differing site condition occurs when the contractor encounters something that's different than conditions ordinarily found to exist and generally recognized as inherent in construction activities of the character provided for in the contract documents. So that's a lot of words, and what it basically means is it may not be shown in the contract documents, but it is something that is not standard. It's not something that you typically find on these kinds of projects. So an example of a type 2 differing site condition would be some kind of unique subsurface condition encountered that's materially different than what's normally found in that area. So let's say a contractor performs subsurface, like foundation work, for several buildings on a particular block. And it's that contractors encountered the same material each time for each of these buildings. And then on the last building on the block, it encounters something completely different. Whatever it encounters, larger boulders, very loose soil, whatever it may be, it's not necessarily represented in the contract documents. The contractor can't go to the contract documents and point to something and say, this is different than what's represented in the contract documents, but what the contractor encountered is different than what is ordinarily found to exist. So that's sort of the nuanced difference between type 1 and type 2 differing site conditions. Moving through this clause, it's important for contractors to remember that there is a deadline to provide notice for a DSC, and under the standard language of the A201, which is highlighted in front of you, notice should be provided within 14 days after the contractor's first observance of the conditions. And it's important to remember that the notice provision is intended to give the architect the ability to review the conditions. So this particular notice provision and the rest of the paragraph here talks about the architect's obligation to review and respond and evaluate this issue, basically. But this notice provision is not a claim pursuant to Article 15, and the architect's determination is not the same as an architect's initial decision. So if either party feels aggrieved at the architect's determination, then that party should file a claim in accordance with Article 15. And then if the architect is the IDM, the initial decision maker, then the architect would reevaluate the issue in the capacity of the initial decision maker and render a decision in accordance with the claim procedures. So, it's important to remember when you're talking about the claims procedure in Article 15 and this notice provision in the differing site conditions clause, there's a lot of processes in the A201 that are intended to keep the work moving while problems and disputes are resolved. And this paragraph is one of those examples. So Sometimes the parties negotiate how much time they'll have to report. They can expand or reduce that 14-day timeline, but the important thing to remember here is that the clause isn't asking for the contractor to provide a solution. You don't have to get to the finish line of where this DSC is going to go and what's going to happen as a result. They don't have to price the impact, determine the time impact or anything like that. They just have to provide notice to the architect and the owner about what they've found. And it's meant to be that way so it can happen relatively quickly, and then the parties can move forward throughout and continue the construction of the work. And with that, like I said, there's another clause below this one in the A201 that talks about discovering some relatively unique human remains and other things like that on the project, which is relatively rare. So just understand that that is there. And with that, Mike, did I miss anything? Knowing that we could probably go on for about an hour if we wanted to.
We could. I'll make it short. I will say that I've given presentations on different site conditions a number of times, and when I've had contractors in the audience and I've asked them if they've found human remains, almost every time somebody's hand goes up. I mean, it's not that uncommon to find
really
human remains. Yeah, I mean, that's why that provision's in there. It's, it might be a once or twice a career kind of a thing, but if you're out there digging around in the soil enough, you're going to find those things as a contractor. I also just want to mention just kind of some commentary on differing site conditions. When I've represented owners in the past and they run into a differing site conditions issue, it can feel very unfair to an owner that, hey, I hired geotechnical engineers, I hired land surveyors, architects, structural engineers, the whole gambit, and I've got a contractor out here who's telling me I ran into something I didn't expect, and now you owe me, or you need to be paying for the unknowns that happened and how to resolve it. And while that can feel a bit unfair, I mean, I just for a little bit of context, when you think about the way that geotechnical engineers do their work, it's very expensive to have and really impossible to have perfect knowledge about what goes on underneath the soil. So you end up doing like soil borings at, kind of regular intervals over a site where you're going to do construction, recognizing the fact that in between those individual soil borings, you don't know what's going on. So it's very possible to find medical waste, human remains, whatever it is. And so it's really, while it can feel unfair that owners typically are the ones who are going to be paying for fixing the differing site conditions issue and coming up with a remedy for that. It's just kind of a natural part of the process,
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, if you like this video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon. You get notified when we post new videos. You can discover more of these videos at aiacontracts.org/learn. If you have questions about the content of our documents, you can send us a note at docinfo@aia.org. If you have questions like tech support questions about the software, you can email us at docstechsupport@aia.org. And as Mike referenced earlier, this is our disclaimer. It basically says we can't provide legal advice. If you do have a legal question, then the best thing to do is consult an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction who can give you information related to and advice related to the facts and circumstances at issue in your case. And with that, thanks very much.